In the lively town of Enugu, Amarachi was a young seamstress whose hands brought beauty to every piece of cloth she touched. She was simple, kind, and full of quiet dreams. When she met Chikazi, a handsome trader with big plans for the future, her heart opened to him like it had been waiting all along. Their love was quick but deep, the kind that made even strangers smile when they walked together. Soon they became husband and wife, and Amarachi believed her prayers had finally been answered. Their home was small but warm, filled with laughter, late-night talks, and little promises of forever. Chikazi often returned from the market with gifts, an orange, a wrapper of fabric, or sweet words that made her blush. Amarachi would sew by the window, waiting eagerly for his footsteps at the door. To her, every moment felt magical, every day a new blessing. When she found out she was pregnant, joy overflowed in her heart. She placed her hands on her belly, whispering to the tiny life inside that it would be loved beyond measure. She told Chikazi the news with teary eyes, and for a moment the world seemed perfect. The community celebrated with them, women ululating, men shaking hands, and neighbors praising the young couple. Amarachi dreamed of a child growing up in laughter, of a family bound together in love. In her heart, she thought nothing could ever break the happiness she had finally found. Amarachi's joy did not last long. Just when she thought life had finally smiled on her, the storm came. News spread through the town like wildfire. Chikazi, the man she loved with her whole heart, the man who promised her forever, had secretly married another woman. Her name was Ngozi, a daughter of a wealthy family, dressed in gold and beads, paraded through the streets as if she were a prize. People whispered that she was more fitting for Chikazi's rising status, a woman who could match his ambitions and give him a higher place in society. Amarachi could not believe it at first. She thought it was just gossip, some cruel rumor meant to hurt her. But when she stepped out of her small home one morning, she saw the truth with her own eyes. Neighbors carrying palm fronds, music and laughter filling the air, and Chikazi himself walking proudly beside Ngozi. The same man who once promised her love now walked past her as if she was invisible. Her heart shattered in that moment. She stood frozen, her hand resting on her swollen belly, feeling her child move inside her. The whispers of the neighbors cut deeper than a knife. "Poor Amarachi," some said with mocking smiles. Others shook their heads in pity, murmuring, "She has been left behind." Her cheeks burned with shame, but she forced herself not to cry in front of them. With trembling hands, she turned back to her little house, each step heavier than the last. Inside, away from prying eyes, the tears finally came. She wept into her pillow, her voice breaking with the kind of pain words cannot carry. "Why, Chikazi?" she whispered into the silence. "Why now, when I carry your child? Why promise me love and then throw me away?" She remembered every laugh they shared, every gift he brought her, every dream they planned together. How quickly love had turned to cruelty. How easily he had chosen another, leaving her to face the world's scorn alone. At night, she would sit by the window, listening to the distant sounds of celebration from Chikazi's new home. The laughter carried through the wind, mocking her broken heart. Sometimes she would place her hands on her belly and whisper to her unborn child, "You are my reason to keep going. I will not let this pain destroy me." Her tears would fall, but in her voice there was strength, the strength of a woman determined to survive. Though the betrayal cut her deeply, Amarachi refused to let her spirit die. She held her head high when she walked through the market, even as whispers followed her. Inside, her heart was bleeding, but she told herself she had to stay strong for the life growing inside her. Still, in the quiet of the night, when no one was watching, she often clutched her belly and wondered how the man who once loved her so fiercely could turn his back so easily. It felt as though her world had ended in a single day. The days after Chikazi's betrayal were the hardest Amarachi had ever known. The same people who once celebrated her marriage now mocked her in whispers and laughter. In the market, women would glance at her belly and murmur, "There goes the discarded wife." Some shook their heads as if her misfortune was her fault, while others laughed behind her back. Amarachi heard it all, but she kept her head high, even when her heart was breaking inside. She refused to let their cruel words crush her completely. Her pregnancy was not easy. Her feet swelled until every step felt heavy, and her back ached from carrying both the child and the weight of abandonment. Still, every morning before the sun rose, she sat at her sewing machine or bent over with needle and thread, stitching clothes for customers. Fabric scraps littered her small room, the steady sound of the needle pushing through cloth echoing like a heartbeat of determination. She told herself, "If I can sew one more dress, I can buy food for tomorrow. If I can work a little longer, my child will never go hungry." At the market, she carried her bundles of clothes with shaking arms, standing on tired feet all day to sell her work. Sometimes customers bargained too hard, taking advantage of her desperation, but Amarachi still smiled and accepted, because every coin mattered. In the heat of the afternoon, sweat dripped from her face, and her baby shifted restlessly inside her. She would pause, place a hand on her belly and whisper, "Be patient, my child. Mama is working for you." Nights were the loneliest. After returning from the market, she lit her small oil lamp and continued sewing late into the night. The silence pressed heavily on her, broken only by the cry of crickets outside or the rustle of neighbors still gossiping. Her fingers grew sore, sometimes pricking her skin until blood stained the fabric, but she kept going. Hunger gnawed at her often, but she would rather endure it than risk her unborn child lacking nourishment. Many nights she wept silently as she sewed, her tears falling onto the clothes she made. And yet, through the pain, Amarachi carried herself with quiet dignity. When she walked through the streets, she did not bow her head in shame. She walked slowly, carefully, with her rounded belly leading the way, as if telling the world, "This life inside me is my pride, not my shame." Children sometimes ran after her, giggling, calling her Mama Olana, though the child was not yet born. Their innocent voices brought her small comfort, reminding her that her life still had meaning. Amarachi's nights of struggle and days of toil became her shield. She was determined that her child would never feel unwanted, never be called a mistake. Every stitch she made was a promise. Every coin she earned was a prayer. Alone and abandoned, she fought in the shadows of pain, but in her heart, she carried the light of a mother's unbreakable love. The night Amarachi went into labor was long and painful. Alone in her small room, she held on to the edge of her wooden bed, her cries muffled by the darkness. Sweat poured down her face, and tears of both pain and fear blurred her eyes. There was no husband to hold her hand, no loving voice to comfort her. Only the midwife from the next compound came, guiding her through each wave of agony. Hours felt like days, but just before dawn, a new cry pierced the silence. Baby girl was born. Amarachi, weak and trembling, gathered her child into her arms. She named her Olana, precious jewel, for to her, this child was more valuable than gold. From the first moment, Olana's tiny laughter became the light in Amarachi's dark world. Though life was hard, Amarachi found strength every time she looked into her daughter's eyes. When neighbors mocked or gossiped, she no longer felt crushed. Instead, she whispered to herself, "I have something they cannot take away. I have my child." She worked harder than ever, sewing clothes in the dim light of her oil lamp, rocking Olana's cradle with her foot while stitching fabric with her hands. Hunger and tiredness followed her, but one smile from Olana made every sacrifice worthwhile. Amarachi raised her daughter with quiet dignity. She may not have been able to give her riches, but she gave her love, discipline, and courage. She taught Olana kindness when others were cruel, strength when life felt unfair, and resilience when the world tried to push them down. "Never let anyone tell you that you are less," Amarachi often said. "You are more than their words. You are my pride." Meanwhile, Chikazi flaunted his new life. He walked proudly through the village with Ngozi by his side, his clothes fine, his laughter loud. They attended ceremonies together, arriving in style, showering money in the air to show off their wealth. People clapped for him, but Amarachi noticed how quickly those same people turned to whisper about her struggles. Chikazi never once came to see his daughter. Not even when Olana was sick with fever did he send a coin or a word of care. To him, Amarachi and the child did not exist. But Olana grew anyway, strong, beautiful, and full of life. She laughed loudly, ran through the streets barefoot, and carried a light that even poverty could not dim. Each time Amarachi heard her daughter's laughter, she felt her spirit heal a little more. That laughter was her shield against shame, her reminder that betrayal did not destroy her, and her proof that even in pain, something beautiful could be born. Amarachi knew she had been abandoned, but when she looked at Olana, she no longer felt empty. She carried her child on her back, head held high, walking through the same streets where people once mocked her. For she had found a new kind of pride, not in being someone's wife, but in being a mother who loved with her whole heart. The years rolled by, and the tiny baby who once clung to Amarachi's chest grew into a young girl with bright eyes and a smile that could melt even the hardest heart. Olana was different from the rest, sharp, curious, and full of grace. She asked questions that surprised even elders, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity far beyond her age. Teachers at school often praised her, saying, "This child is destined for greatness." Neighbors who once mocked Amarachi now watched Olana with admiration, whispering how such beauty and wisdom could grow from so much pain. Amarachi, though still carrying the scars of betrayal, poured every drop of love into her daughter. She made sure Olana never felt the absence of a father. When children in the village asked her why her father never came for her, Olana would lift her chin and say proudly, "I have my mother. That is enough." And truly it was. For Amarachi was mother and father, protector and teacher, provider and friend. Life was never easy. There were days when food was scarce, when money was short, and when illness threatened their peace. Yet Amarachi never stopped working. Her tailoring shop, once a small corner in the market, slowly grew. People began to notice not only the quality of her clothes, but also the dignity with which she carried herself. Her hands stitched not just fabric but hope, and soon her name became respected in Enugu. Customers came from far and near, trusting Amarachi's touch with their garments. Every coin she earned went into Olana's future. She saved for her school fees, bought her books, and sometimes stayed up late into the night, sewing by the dim glow of her lamp, whispering prayers with every stitch. Olana would often sit beside her, doing homework, pausing only to smile at her mother. "Mama, one day I will make you proud," she would say, and Amarachi's tired eyes would fill with tears. "My child," she always replied, "you already have." As Olana grew into a young woman, her beauty became the talk of the town. But it was not just her looks that caught people's attention. It was her mind, her kindness, and her confidence. She walked through the streets with grace, greeting the old, comforting children, and speaking with wisdom. Many admired her. Yet she remained humble, always remembering the sacrifices her mother made. For Amarachi, Olana was more than a daughter. She was proof that pain could give birth to something powerful, that betrayal could turn into blessing. When Amarachi looked at her grown daughter, she no longer felt like the abandoned woman everyone once mocked. She felt victorious. Life was still a struggle, but together mother and daughter had built something stronger than wealth or status. A bond no betrayal could break. They were each other's greatest treasure, and in that love, they found strength to face whatever came next. The day Chikazi returned to Enugu, the village could hardly believe their eyes. Years had passed since he left with pride in his step and wealth in his pocket, flaunting his new wife Ngozi, as though Amarachi and her child had never existed. But the man who came back was not the same. His once strong shoulders were bent, his fine clothes were now worn and dusty, and his face carried the shadows of sleepless nights. The whispers spread quickly. His riches are gone. His second marriage has fallen apart. The mighty trader has lost everything. Amarachi heard the news while she was at her sewing table. For a moment, her hands froze on the fabric, memories rushing back like a flood. His betrayal, her tears, the nights of hunger. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that those years had made her stronger. She had built a life with Olana, a life he had no part in. But Chikazi was not done. One afternoon, as the village square filled with people buying and selling, he appeared. His eyes swept over the crowd until they landed on Olana. She was no longer the baby he had abandoned. She was now a young woman, graceful and intelligent, her beauty shining in a way that made everyone stop and stare. Chikazi's chest rose as if pride had suddenly returned to him. He stepped forward and declared in a loud voice, "She is my blood. She must return to me." The square fell silent. People dropped their baskets of yams and palm oil, turning to watch the scene unfold. Amarachi, standing close by, felt her heart pound. The same man who had turned his back on her in her most vulnerable moment now stood with boldness, claiming rights over the child he had never cared for. His voice trembled, but his words were sharp. "By tradition, my child belongs to me. She must come to her father's house." Gasps rose from the crowd. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others whispered to one another. They remembered Amarachi's years of struggle, the swollen feet as she worked during pregnancy, the sleepless nights of sewing, the sacrifices she made to give Olana a future. Now this man, pale and broken from his own mistakes, wanted to snatch away the very treasure she had raised with her blood and sweat. Amarachi stepped forward, her hands steady though her chest burned with anger. She stood tall, her wrapper tied firmly around her waist, her eyes locked on Chikazi. Her silence at first was louder than his words. Olana, standing beside her mother, felt the weight of the moment. She had grown up hearing stories, sensing the pain her mother carried, but now the truth stood before her in flesh and blood, the man who had given her life but abandoned her soul. The square buzzed with tension, everyone waiting to see what Amarachi would say. Chikazi looked around, desperate for support, but the same neighbors who once celebrated his wealth now only watched, their faces unreadable. The air felt heavy, as though the entire village held its breath. For the first time in many years, the betrayer stood before the woman he had wronged, and the daughter he had ignored, ready to claim what he no longer deserved. The square was heavy with silence as Chikazi's voice rang out, full of entitlement. He puffed his chest, trying to sound strong even though his clothes hung loose on his tired frame. "By tradition," he shouted, "a child belongs to her father's house. Olana is my blood, and she must come with me. It is my right." His words echoed against the walls of the market stalls, stirring murmurs among the crowd. Some nodded quietly, remembering the old customs, while others frowned, uneasy with the audacity of a man who had abandoned his child now speaking of rights. Amarachi stepped forward slowly, her wrapper swaying in the breeze, her face calm but her eyes burning with fire. The same community that once mocked her now gathered around, waiting to see if she would bow her head in shame or rise in defiance. For a moment, the weight of the years pressed on her, the whispers, the insults, the lonely nights. But she stood tall, her daughter beside her, and raised her voice so everyone could hear. "Where were you, Chikazi?" she asked, her voice trembling but strong, "when hunger cried in the night? When my child's stomach was empty and I had only tears to give her? Where were you when fever burned her skin, and I sat awake with no money for medicine, praying God would spare her life?" The crowd gasped. Her words were sharp, slicing through the false pride that Chikazi carried. Amarachi stepped closer, her hand resting firmly on Olana's shoulder. "Where were you when she needed school fees, when her shoes tore, when she cried herself to sleep asking why her father never came? Tell me, Chikazi, where were you?" Chikazi opened his mouth but no words came. His eyes darted around, searching the faces of the villagers for support. But all he saw were frowns, eyes filled with judgment and heads shaking. Those who once praised his wealth now remembered his cruelty. Amarachi's voice grew stronger. "This child you call yours was never yours in deed, only in blood. A father is not just the man who plants the seed, but the one who waters it, nurtures it, and shields it from the storm. You were never that man." Olana, her eyes glistening, clung to her mother's arm. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some whispering prayers, others saying, "She is right." The weight of truth filled the air like thunder before rainfall. Chikazi's face darkened, shame creeping over him. His hands shook as he tried to protest, but Amarachi raised her hand, silencing him. "Do not speak of rights, Chikazi. You gave them up the day you chose wealth over love, pride over responsibility. This child belongs to the one who never left her. And that person is me." The villagers broke into applause, their voices rising with Amarachi's strength. In that moment, the woman once called the discarded wife stood tall, unbroken, her dignity shining brighter than any tradition. And Chikazi, once the proud trader, stood speechless, swallowed by the weight of his own betrayal. For a moment after Amarachi's words, The marketplace remained still. The people looked from her to Chickasee, their hearts torn between old traditions and the truth they had just heard. Then, slowly, an elder stepped forward. Chief Namdi, one of the most respected voices in the community, walked with his staff tapping against the ground. His presence alone commanded silence. The crowd parted for him, and all eyes followed as he moved closer to Amarachi and Chickasee. He raised his hand and spoke in a calm but steady tone. I have watched this story unfold from the beginning. I saw Amarachi when she was heavy with child, abandoned by the man who now shouts of rights. I saw her in the market with swollen feet, still carrying clothes on her head just to feed herself and her unborn baby. I saw her sit through nights of hunger, sewing with the light of a dying lamp, just so this girl, Olana, would have a better tomorrow. The people nodded, remembering the nights they passed her small window and saw her hunched over her sewing machine. Some murmured in agreement, "It is true, we all saw it." Chief Namdi turned to Chickasee, his voice growing harder. "And you, where were you? You paraded with wealth. You spent years flaunting your new wife, drinking palm wine, and wasting your riches in vanity. You forgot the woman who once cooked for you, the woman who carried your name, the child who carried your blood. You abandoned them. And now that your wealth has crumbled, you dare to return and speak of tradition." Chickasee shifted uneasily, his eyes dropping to the ground. His lips trembled, but no words came. The silence around him was heavier than any insult. One by one, neighbors began to speak up. A woman from the market cried out, "I remember when Olana was sick with fever. Amarachi sold her last wrapper to pay for medicine." "Not once did you come, Chickasee," another man added. "I remember when her school fees were due. Amarachi worked day and night, sewing without rest. You did nothing. It was her sweat that educated this child, not your pride." Voices rose from different corners of the crowd, each telling a piece of Amarachi's sacrifice. The weight of truth surrounded Chickasee until he looked smaller than he had ever been. His pride seemed to vanish into the dust of the square. Chief Namdi raised his staff again, his words final and firm. "Blood alone does not make a father. Responsibility does. Love does. Sacrifice does. Amarachi has proven herself not only as a mother but as the true parent of this child. Chickasee, you have no claim here. You abandoned your right the moment you abandoned them." The air grew heavy with the truth. The people, once quick to mock Amarachi, now bowed their heads in respect. Chickasee stood frozen, silenced by the weight of his own shame, while Amarachi's dignity shone brighter than ever. Chickasee's face turned pale as Chief Namdi's words echoed through the square. For the first time in years, he had no power, no wealth, no voice strong enough to silence the truth. His hands shook at his sides, and the proud man who once walked the streets with his head held high now stood trembling like a shadow of himself. The villagers who once praised him for his riches now pulled back in shame. Some folded their arms, glaring at him with disgust. Others shook their heads, whispering, "So this is the man we once honored. This is the man who abandoned his own blood." Even those who used to sit at his table and drink his wine looked away, unwilling to be associated with him any longer. The laughter he once bought with money had turned into silence, heavy and cold. Chickasee tried to speak, his lips parting as if to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. He looked around desperately, searching for even one ally in the crowd, but there were none. His pride had died long ago, first with his betrayal, then with his wasted years of vanity. Now, nothing was left but the humiliation of a man stripped of respect. And then Olana stepped forward. Her eyes were steady, her voice clear. She looked at her father, the man who had never been there, and then at her mother, the woman who had carried her through every storm. With her head high, she declared, "My loyalty belongs to the one who never left me. My loyalty belongs to my mother." The square erupted. Some clapped, others shouted in agreement, their voices rising together like thunder. "Yes, she speaks the truth," cried one woman. "Her mother is the true parent," shouted another. The sound rolled through the crowd until it became a wave of support for Amarachi and her daughter. Chickasee's body shook under the weight of the rejection. His own daughter had chosen publicly, leaving him exposed before everyone. He could no longer hide behind tradition or pride. The truth was too clear. He had abandoned them, and in return, he was the one abandoned. Amarachi stood silently, her hand gently resting on Olana's shoulder, tears welling in her eyes. But they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of victory. She had been mocked, humiliated, and left alone to suffer. Yet now the same people who once laughed at her were standing on her side. Her daughter's words had sealed everything she had fought for all these years. Chikazi lowered his head, unable to meet the eyes of anyone in the crowd. The proud trader who once thought himself untouchable was now nothing more than a man stripped bare by his own actions. The marketplace buzzed with voices, but none spoke for him. In that moment, his humiliation was complete. He had lost his wealth, his respect, his community, and most painfully, the daughter he thought he could claim by blood. And as the people cheered Amarachi and Olana, Chikazi was left standing alone, a broken shadow of the man he once pretended to be. The marketplace slowly began to clear, but the air still carried the echoes of Olana's brave words. Amarachi held her daughter's hand tightly, her heart swelling with a pride she had never known before. For years she had carried the heavy name of the abandoned woman, mocked and pitied in whispers, but now those same voices rose in respect and admiration. Neighbors who once turned their backs now stepped forward, nodding and smiling at her with warmth. Some women reached out to touch her arm, saying softly, "You are strong, Amarachi. You are the mother every child deserves." Men bowed their heads in acknowledgement, realizing that her quiet sacrifices had built more honor than wealth ever could. Amarachi's lips curved into a gentle smile. She was no longer walking in shame. She was walking in dignity, surrounded by support. Beside her, Olana stood tall, her eyes shining with love for her mother. She had seen the struggles, the sleepless nights, the endless sewing by candlelight. Now, seeing her mother celebrated, she felt proud beyond words. Amarachi had not only raised her but had shown her what true resilience meant. Meanwhile, at the edge of the square, Chikazi stood motionless, his shoulders bent, his once proud figure reduced to a shadow. No one paid him attention anymore. He had become invisible, forgotten by the same community that once sang his praises. All his wealth and pride had crumbled into dust, leaving him alone with his regrets. Amarachi did not look back. With Olana's hand in hers and the community finally on her side, she walked forward with quiet strength. She was no longer the woman who had been abandoned. She was the woman who had survived, endured, and risen above. And that was her victory,